This is the unknown zone, where history hides its most brilliant secrets. Tonight, we reveal the deception that changed the course of World War II, a plan so audacious, so intricate, that it fooled the entire Nazi command and paved the way for D-Day. This is the story of how lies won the greatest war in history. This is Operation Bodyguard, the web of deception behind D-Day. The year was 1943. Europe was still under the iron grip of Nazi occupation. Germany controlled France, the Low Countries, and much of Eastern Europe. The Allied forces, Britain, the United States, and their allies, were planning what would become the largest amphibious invasion in human history, the liberation of Europe through the beaches of France. But to succeed, they needed more than ships and soldiers. They needed to outthink Adolf Hitler himself. Because the Nazis expected an invasion. They just didn't know where. And in war, surprise is victory. From the beginning, Allied intelligence understood one terrible truth. If the Germans guessed the invasion point correctly, the landings would fail. The beaches would be fortified. Tens of thousands would die before even reaching the shore. So, the Allies decided to fight their most important battle before the first soldier set foot in France, not with bullets, but with lies. This would become Operation Bodyguard, the grand deception campaign that misled Hitler, divided his armies, and opened the gates of Normandy. The name came from Winston Churchill himself. In a meeting with his generals in 1943, he remarked, "In wartime, truth is so precious that she should always be attended by a bodyguard of lies." The phrase stuck. And so, the deception operation was born. At its core, Operation Bodyguard had one mission: to make Hitler believe the Allies would invade anywhere but Normandy. To do this, the Allies created an entire universe of false information. Fake armies, fake divisions, fake generals, fake radio traffic, even fake spies feeding fake intelligence to real German agents. It would be the most elaborate deception in modern history, a masterpiece of illusion played on a global stage. The mastermind behind the plan was a small team of intelligence officers, map makers, and visionaries from the British War Office and the American Office of Strategic Services, the OSAs. The group was led by Colonel John Bevan, head of the London Controlling Section, or LCS, the brain of Allied deception strategy. Bevan and his team had already learned from earlier operations that deception could win battles. They'd seen it in Operation Mincemeat, where a dead body carrying false papers had tricked the Germans into moving troops away from Sicily. Now, they planned to scale that idea to an entire continent. Bodyguard was divided into multiple sub-operations, each designed to feed the same lie from different directions. Together, they would form an unbreakable illusion that the Allies' real target was Pas de Calais, the narrowest point between Britain and France, and not Normandy. The Germans believed Calais was the most logical invasion site. It had the shortest crossing distance, direct rail links to Germany, and was heavily fortified. The Allies decided to reinforce that belief until Hitler was absolutely certain. To do that, they needed three things: a fake army, a believable story, and perfect timing. The fake army came first. It would be called the First U.S. Army Group, or FUSAG, a completely fictional force created on paper. It supposedly consisted of hundreds of thousands of men, tanks, and aircraft preparing to attack Calais. In reality, it was a ghost. To make it real, the Allies used every trick they had. They built inflatable tanks that looked real from the air. They constructed wooden airplanes on fake airfields. They laid out truck tire tracks and created dummy supply depots. Even fake radio operators sent constant coded transmissions that German intelligence intercepted, all matching the movements of an army that didn't exist. The genius part, it was all led by a real general. That general was George S. Patton, one of the most famous and aggressive commanders in the U.S. Army. The Germans feared him. They considered him the Allies' most capable field leader. So when Allied intelligence placed Patton in charge of the fictional Fusag and had him make public appearances in southeastern England, the Germans believed it instantly. To them, Patton leading a Calais invasion made perfect sense. They didn't realize he was commanding air-filled tanks and plywood artillery. It was a deception so perfect that even Hitler himself called Patton the most dangerous man in the Allied army. The next part of Bodyguard focused on disinformation through spies. Throughout the war, British intelligence had captured or turned nearly every German agent operating in the United Kingdom. They called it the double-cross system. These double agents would now become the messengers of the Grand Deception. Among the most important was Juan Pujol Garcia, codenamed Garbo, a Spanish double agent who had built an entire network of fake sub-spies. He regularly sent long, detailed reports to the Germans filled with fabricated troop movements and invasion plans. His information was so convincing that German intelligence decorated him with the Iron Cross, even though he was working for Britain. Through Garbo and others, false intelligence flowed steadily toward Berlin. It all pointed to one conclusion: the invasion would come at Calais. Meanwhile, to keep the illusion alive, the Allies launched smaller deception operations across Europe. Operation Glimmer and Operation Taxable used radar-reflecting chaff dropped by planes to simulate invasion fleets heading toward Calais. Operation Zeppelin spread rumors of Allied attacks on Greece and the Balkans. Operation Copperhead sent an actor disguised as General Montgomery on a fake trip to Gibraltar to suggest that the invasion was still weeks away. Each lie supported the others. Each rumor made the next more believable. By the spring of 1944, the web was complete. But the success of Operation Bodyguard would depend on one thing: timing. The deception had to hold until the real invasion force was ashore in Normandy. If the Germans realized the truth too soon, they could move their reserves and crush the Allies before they established a foothold. And so, in the final days before D-Day, the deception reached its climax. Double agents sent urgent messages to Berlin confirming that Patton's 1st U.S. Army Group was ready to attack Calais. Fake radio chatter increased. Reconnaissance photos were manipulated to show fake equipment. Even weather forecasts were falsified to suggest the real landings were impossible on June 6th. The stage was set. The illusion was complete. The greatest invasion in history was about to begin, hidden behind the greatest lie ever told. In the early hours of June 6, 1944, as Allied ships crossed the English Channel toward Normandy, Hitler still believed the real invasion was yet to come. When reports of the Normandy landings reached his headquarters, he dismissed them as a diversion. He refused to release his armored divisions from Calais, convinced that Patton's main force would strike there at any moment. For 7 crucial weeks, he held those divisions in place, waiting for an army that didn't exist. By the time he realized the truth, it was too late. Normandy was secure. The Allies had landed. Europe's liberation had begun. War isn't only fought with weapons. It's fought with perception, with what your enemy believes to be true. And during 1944, the greatest battlefield wasn't Normandy. It was inside Hitler's mind. Operation Bodyguard wasn't just about fake tanks or false messages. It was about shaping thought, manipulating logic, fear, and ego, until the enemy's confidence became his blindness. And in that game, the Allies were unmatched. In the months leading up to D-Day, Hitler's intelligence empire stretched across Europe. The Abwehr, Germany's military intelligence service, prided itself on its network of spies, informants, and analysts. But what Hitler didn't know was that nearly every one of those spies in Britain had been captured and turned. By 1944, not a single German agent in Britain was truly loyal to Germany. Every piece of information flowing from the United Kingdom was under Allied control. It meant that when Berlin received reports of troop movements, supply stockpiles, and coded messages, all of it came from the Allies themselves. They weren't just feeding Hitler lies. They were building him a reality. At the center of that illusion was Agent Garbo, the Spanish double agent Juan Pujol Garcia. From a small London flat, Garbo fabricated an entire spy network. 27 imaginary sub-agents stationed across Britain. Each had a name, a backstory, and a specific military focus. One supposedly monitored shipyards in Liverpool. Another was a pilot liaison in Kent. A third reported from Scotland. Garbo would send detailed reports to the Germans. All handwritten, all believable, all false. He described fake convoys, invented units, and the build-up of Patton's 1st U.S. Army Group. He even included delays in communication, explaining that his agents sometimes took days to relay reports, which made his intelligence seem authentic, not conveniently timed. The Germans believed him completely. They even paid salaries to his imaginary spies. And by the spring of 1944, they were relying on his information to shape their defenses. But Garbo wasn't alone. Other double agents reinforced the same narrative. There was Agent Brutus, a Polish officer turned British double agent who passed false details about invasion logistics. There was Agent Tricycle, a Yugoslav businessman who pretended to run a spy ring across London. There was Agent Tate, who sent fake radio traffic matching the Phantom Army's movements. Together, these agents formed a web of deceit so tightly woven that it became indistinguishable from the truth. It was a psychological masterpiece. Meanwhile, German intelligence analysts grew increasingly confident in their assessment. Intercepted Allied communications, many of them deliberate fakes, confirmed the presence of large formations in southeastern England. Reconnaissance photos showed airfields and depots, all props created by the British Royal Engineers. Reports from occupied France described unusual radio patterns. All signs pointed to Calais. To any rational observer, it looked undeniable. And that was the brilliance of Operation Bodyguard. The Allies didn't just feed Germany what they wanted them to believe. They gave them evidence. Every kind of sensory confirmation possible. Visual, auditory, human, and electronic. It wasn't just propaganda. It was total perception control. Inside Hitler's headquarters, the wolf's lair, the deception found its perfect victim. Hitler had long believed that Calais was the most strategic invasion point. It was the shortest crossing, closest to Germany, and heavily fortified. His generals tried to warn him that the Allies might attack elsewhere, but he refused to listen. To him, logic was destiny, and logic said Calais. Operation Bodyguard turned that certainty against him. Every report, every radio intercept, every photograph reinforced his own belief. The Allies didn't need to change his mind, they just needed to feed it. By early June 1944, Hitler was convinced. He ordered the 15th Army, Germany's most powerful reserve force, to remain stationed around Calais. It was to be held there at all costs, to crush the main invasion when it came. Even when the Normandy landings began, Hitler refused to release them. He called the Normandy assault a diversion, a feint designed to draw German forces away from the real attack. He was so sure, so completely convinced by the web of lies, that he delayed the counterattack for nearly 7 weeks. Those 7 weeks changed history. But Operation Bodyguard wasn't flawless. There were close calls, moments where the entire deception could have collapsed. One came when a German reconnaissance plane accidentally photographed a section of the English coast that looked suspiciously empty. No movement, no real troop activity. Berlin grew uneasy. If the invasion force was really gathering for Calais, why was there no sign of life? To fix it, Allied deception teams staged massive fake maneuvers. They moved inflatable tanks overnight, created new tire tracks, and even deployed hundreds of soldiers dressed as engineers and mechanics to maintain the equipment. The next time the Germans flew over, everything looked alive again. Another near disaster came when one double agent, Agent Bronx, grew nervous and hinted to his German contact that the invasion might happen somewhere unexpected. The message was intercepted by British intelligence before it reached Berlin, and Bronx was quietly removed from the network. The illusion held. When D-Day arrived on June 6, 1944, German radar screens lit up with dozens of false readings. Allied aircraft dropped strips of aluminum foil, chaff, to create phantom invasion fleets approaching Calais and Norway. Operation Glimmer and Operation Taxable simulated entire naval armadas through radar echoes. Meanwhile, radio operators kept transmitting from Patton's army headquarters, sending constant traffic as if a second invasion was about to launch. To the Germans, it looked like 2 wars unfolding at once. They couldn't tell which was real. For days after the Normandy landings, the deception continued. Agent Garbo sent new messages confirming that Normandy was merely the first phase, that the main strike would come at Calais within 2 weeks. The Germans believed it completely. They refused to move their 15th Army. They left tanks idle. They waited for Patton. That one decision, to wait, doomed them. By the time they realized there was no second invasion, Allied forces had pushed deep into France, captured key ports, and broken through the German lines. The deception had done its job. Historians often say D-Day was won on the beaches of Normandy, but in truth, it was won months earlier, in the offices of MI5, in the fake radio stations of Southeast England, and in the mind of a dictator who believed what he wanted to believe. Operation Bodyguard was more than a plan. It was a psychological symphony, an orchestration of illusions so vast that it reshaped the battlefield itself. It taught the world that information could be as lethal as artillery, and that sometimes the most powerful weapon is belief. The invasion of Normandy had begun. June 6, 1944, D-Day. As dawn broke over the English Channel, The Allied Armada, over 5,000 ships and landing craft, moved through rough seas toward the beaches of northern France. The world was watching, though few understood the scale of what was happening. To the soldiers fighting their way through the surf, this was the battle to free Europe. To the generals behind the scenes, it was also the battle to keep the lie alive. Because even as the first wave of Allied troops landed in Normandy, the deception of Operation Bodyguard was far from over. In fact, it was entering its most critical phase. In Berlin, the early morning reports caused confusion. German coastal defenses from Normandy to Calais had been on high alert for weeks. Hitler's generals, Field Marshal Rundstedt in the west and Rommel in Normandy, had both warned that the Allies would strike soon. But even now, as reports flooded in from the French coast, no one could agree on what it meant. Was Normandy the real invasion, or just a diversion before the main attack at Calais? The answer mattered more than anything, because Germany's best forces, its tanks, its reserves, its experienced divisions, were still waiting far to the north, near Calais, and that was exactly where the Allies wanted them. At 7:08 a.m. on June 6th, Field Marshal von Rundstedt called Berlin, urging immediate release of panzer reinforcements to counter the Normandy assault. But Hitler was asleep. He had given strict orders not to wake him without confirmation that the main invasion had begun. By the time he finally woke and received the reports, it was late morning, and his first reaction was disbelief. He told his staff, "This cannot be the main invasion. It's a diversion to draw our forces from Calais." His generals hesitated. Some wanted to move the 15th Army south at once, but others, those who had been reading the intelligence from Britain, insisted that Patton's army was still preparing for the real assault. They pointed to fresh radio traffic, new reconnaissance photos, and agent reports that matched the Calais scenario perfectly. None of them knew that every bit of that evidence had been planted. In southeast England, Allied deception teams went into overdrive. Fake radio transmissions from the 1st U.S. Army Group continued non-stop, simulating troop movements, supply requests, and coded orders. Operators worked in shifts to maintain the illusion 24 hours a day. The airwaves crackled with fake chatter. To German monitors, it was proof that a second, larger invasion force was still forming. Meanwhile, the Royal Air Force executed the next stage of the deception. Operation Glimmer and Operation Taxable. Aircraft flew in precise circles off the French coast, dropping bundles of metallic foil called window or chaff. Each strip reflected radar waves, creating phantom fleets that seemed to move toward Calais and Boulogne. German radar screens lit up with ghost armadas. Even naval observers along the French coast reported seeing ships on the horizon that weren't there. The illusion was total. As the real soldiers fought their way inland through Normandy, through chaos, blood, and fire, their fate was still tied to the success of the deception. If Hitler realized the truth too soon, he could unleash the full force of the German army and crush them before they broke out of the beaches. But the deception held. Day after day, the Germans waited for the real invasion that never came. Agent Garbo, still operating from London, sent urgent messages to his German handlers. He warned that the Normandy attack was only the first wave, a diversion to hide the main blow at Calais. He wrote that Patton's forces were ready to launch at any moment once the Allies confirmed the German response. The messages were perfectly timed. They kept the Germans paralyzed. Berlin believed that the Allies had sacrificed thousands of men in Normandy just to trick them. The irony was that the lie they feared most was the truth they refused to see. Weeks passed. Normandy turned from a beachhead into a fortress. The Allies brought in supplies, vehicles, and reinforcements. By late June, over 1 million Allied troops were on French soil. Yet still, the 15th Army, nearly 19 divisions, sat motionless at Calais, waiting for Patton's phantom invasion. Every night, German officers looked out over the English Channel, searching for the massive fleet that intelligence said would come. They saw nothing, but they waited. Even when captured prisoners confirmed the landings were real, Berlin dismissed their testimony. They were part of the deception the High Command insisted. The illusion had grown stronger than reality itself. Inside Hitler's headquarters, the atmosphere was surreal. Reports from the front grew more desperate. Normandy was collapsing into chaos. German lines were breaking under constant Allied bombardment. But Hitler refused to shift his reserves. He believed that any movement south would expose Calais to the true invasion. He told his generals, "The decisive blow is yet to come. The attack at Normandy is a feint." By mid-July, as Allied tanks closed in on Saint-Lô and Caen, Hitler finally began to suspect something was wrong. But it was too late. Normandy was lost, and with it, the western wall of Nazi Europe began to crumble. While the deception had begun as a calculated strategy, it ended as a psychological mirror, revealing how the same arrogance that built the Third Reich also blinded it. Hitler's refusal to question his own certainty became the Allies' greatest weapon. The deception worked not because it was flawless, but because it fit perfectly into the enemy's mind. The Germans believed what they wanted to believe, and the Allies gave them exactly that. In the aftermath of D-Day, Allied intelligence reflected on what they had accomplished. Through misinformation, they had delayed the German counterattack by nearly 7 weeks, time that allowed the Allies to consolidate, expand, and ultimately break out of Normandy. Historians later estimated that Operation Bodyguard saved tens of thousands of lives. It turned one of the most dangerous invasions in history into a calculated victory. And it proved that deception, when executed with precision, could win wars faster than force. But the operation's success also raised a deeper question, one that would echo through intelligence history for decades. If lies could save lives, how far should nations go to use them? And when does deception become a weapon too powerful to control? The answers would shape the entire Cold War that followed. A war fought not just with bombs and armies, but with disinformation, propaganda, and psychological manipulation on a global scale. The seeds of that shadow war were planted here, in Operation Bodyguard, where truth itself became a weapon. By August 1944, the illusion that had fooled an empire began to collapse. Normandy was secure. The Allies had broken through German defenses and were racing across France toward Paris. The beaches that had once seemed like a desperate gamble were now the foundation of victory. But in the ashes of the deception, another battle began, the battle for truth. Because in the war of lies, everyone eventually seeks to know what was real. In Germany, confusion turned to disbelief. For months, the High Command had received reports confirming that a massive Allied army, Patton's 1st U.S. Army Group, was preparing to invade Calais. But now, with France falling and no second invasion in sight, the German generals began to realize the horrifying truth. They had been deceived, not by one lie, but by 1,000. Each small, believable detail had built a world that wasn't real, and they had lived inside it. Captured German officers later told Allied interrogators that they had believed in the Calais invasion until August. Some admitted that even as their troops retreated through France, they still expected a second Allied landing that never came. The most painful revelation came from Hitler's own staff. Documents recovered after the war showed that Hitler himself had been receiving daily intelligence summaries confirming the imminent Calais assault long after D-Day. The Allies had fed him not just false facts, but false confidence. He had trusted his spies, his analysts, and his own logic, all of which were working against him. In the months following the success of Operation Bodyguard, Allied intelligence officers began analyzing every part of the deception. Reports were written, code names archived, and results measured in cold detail. They realized they had done something no military in history had achieved before. They had weaponized perception. They hadn't just hidden the truth. They had replaced it. The London Controlling Section, the secret body that designed Bodyguard, was quietly disbanded in late 1944. Its members returned to civilian life, carrying with them secrets that would shape future wars. But the knowledge didn't vanish. It was studied, replicated, and evolved. The techniques of deception, fake radio traffic, psychological manipulation, and double-agent networks became the blueprint for a new kind of warfare. As the Cold War emerged, intelligence agencies on both sides, the CIA in the United States and the KGB in the Soviet Union, studied the Bodyguard files with fascination. They saw in it a new kind of power, the ability to control an enemy's actions, not by force, but by belief. Deception operations became standard practice. Disinformation campaigns were launched across Europe and Asia. Entire fake networks were created to influence decisions, elections, and even international treaties. The lessons of Operation Bodyguard had transcended war itself. They had entered politics, propaganda, and psychological control. But among those who had designed the operation, not all felt pride. Some felt unease. Colonel John Bevan, who had overseen much of the planning, later reflected that Bodyguard was a necessary lie, a deception that saved lives but also blurred the line between truth and manipulation. In a private letter written years later, he described his fear that the same methods used to win the war could be used to control peace. He was right. The Cold War would become a conflict of illusions. Invisible armies of misinformation waging silent battles across borders and minds. The world had learned how to lie strategically, and it had learned it from Operation Bodyguard. The Germans, too, studied the deception long after the war. Captured intelligence officers examined how they had failed to see through it. Their reports concluded that the deception had succeeded not because of superior Allied technology, but because of human nature. They wrote that the Allies had understood psychology better than the Nazis understood power. While Hitler built a regime on fear and obedience, the Allies built an illusion on logic and credibility. They didn't force the Germans to believe. They led them to believe. It was a subtle difference, but a devastating one. In the years that followed, Operation Bodyguard became a case study for every major intelligence service. Its influence spread quietly, shaping doctrines of misinformation and strategic communication. By the 1950s, both NATO and the Warsaw Pact were using versions of Bodyguard's techniques, controlled leaks, phantom divisions, and double agents to mislead each other. New phrases entered the vocabulary of intelligence, perception management, deniable operations, psychological deterrence. Each was rooted in the same principle. Truth is not what is real, but what your enemy believes to be real. For the men who fought in Normandy, the deception had been invisible. They never saw the shadow war that had cleared their path to victory. But history would come to understand that D-Day's success was not just a triumph of bravery. It was a triumph of intelligence. The soldiers stormed the beaches, but the spies and deceivers had already won the battle in the mind. In 1972, long after the war, the British government finally declassified parts of the Bodyguard files. Journalists and historians were stunned. The scale of the deception was far greater than anyone had imagined. From fake divisions to phantom generals, from false telegrams to double agents, every layer of the lie had worked together like gears in a machine. It was not luck, it was design. The files revealed something deeper too, that Bodyguard had saved lives on both sides. By misleading the Germans into defending the wrong coastline, it had reduced the intensity of the fighting at Normandy's most vulnerable points. Thousands of soldiers, Allied and German, survived battles that never happened. The truth of the deception was that even lies can sometimes preserve life. Today, the legacy of Operation Bodyguard lives in every major military campaign that uses misinformation as strategy. Modern warfare, cyber deception, false intelligence, digital propaganda, all trace their roots back to this single plan. Bodyguard taught the world that in the age of information, the mind is the first battlefield. It proved that wars are not only won by strength, but by imagination, and that truth, once weaponized, can become the most dangerous force of all. In the ruins of Hitler's bunker, when the war finally ended, Allied soldiers found maps and notes showing the German interpretation of the invasion. Even in the final days, they still believed in Patton's ghost army. The illusion had outlived the war itself. A deception that began as a whisper in Churchill's office had grown into a storm that reshaped the world. It showed humanity that information is both shield and sword, that every truth needs its bodyguard, and every lie needs its moment to serve a greater truth. This was Operation Bodyguard, the deception that protected D-Day, the web of lies that freed Europe, and the proof that sometimes, to save the world, you must first deceive it.